Imagine waking up in a world where your career isn't chosen by your talents or your passion, but by a gray bureaucrat in a distant office who decided 3 years ago exactly which factory floor you would die on. Did you know that while the American dream was propelling janitors to CEOs through sheer grit and innovation, the Soviet workers' paradise was actually a high-walled prison where guaranteed employment was just a polite term for state-mandated serfdom? Today, we are smashing the myth of socialist equality to reveal the brutal truth: how the US built a ladder to the stars while the USSR built a hamster wheel in a cage. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button right now, and stay with us until the very end. Because in the final part, we're going to expose the secret aristocracy, the shadowy Soviet elite who lived like kings while preaching poverty to the masses, and how their greed eventually triggered the greatest economic heart attack in human history. The concept of work was the fundamental battlefield of the Cold War, a clash between the self-made man and the state-owned cog that defined the fate of millions. And while the United States was nurturing a culture of radical individual agency, where your social standing was a reflection of your contribution to the marketplace, the Soviet Union was perfecting a system of involuntary contribution, where the individual was merely a biological asset of the Communist Party. In the American 1980s, the workplace was an arena of hypermobility, a place where the American dream wasn't just a slogan, but a functioning economic engine that rewarded risk, specialized knowledge, and the relentless pursuit of self-improvement. Across the Iron Curtain, work was a legal obligation enforced by the parasitism laws, a grim reality where not having a job was a criminal offense that could land you in a labor camp, turning the act of earning a living into a desperate act of avoiding the police. This fundamental divide between work as freedom and work as duty is why the American economy became a garden of innovation, while the Soviet economy became a graveyard of wasted potential, proving that when you steal a man's right to choose his path, you steal his soul along with his labor. The contrast in social mobility and the ladder of success revealed the difference between a society of movement and a society of stone. In the US, the 1980s saw the explosion of the yuppie culture and the tech revolution, where a college degree or a brilliant idea in a garage could catapult a person from the lower middle class into the heights of global influence within a single decade. The American system was built on the meritocratic promise, an imperfect but powerful machine that allowed for the constant churning of the elite, ensuring that new blood and new ideas were always rising to the top. In the USSR, social mobility was a vertical dead end. Unless you were a member of the party nomenklatura, your life path was determined at birth. The son of a miner was destined to be a miner, and the daughter of a weaver was destined to stay at the loom. The Soviet system replaced the ladder of success with the anchor of stability, a world where the state promised you would never fall, but also ensured you would never rise, creating a stagnant society where ambition was treated as a suspicious bourgeois trait, and the only way to move up was to inform on your neighbors or marry into a bureaucrat's family. The role of entrepreneurship versus the command economy showed which system was built for the future and which was anchored in the dark ages of feudalism. In the US, the 1980s were the golden age of the self-made billionaire, where icons like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates proved that the most valuable resource in the world wasn't oil or steel, but the human imagination unfettered by government interference. The American marketplace was a brutal but brilliant filter that rewarded efficiency and punished obsolescence, forcing every worker and manager to constantly innovate just to survive. In the USSR, private enterprise was a crime punishable by death or the gulag. The state-run Gosplan decided how many shoes were made and what color they should be, leading to a reality where factories produced millions of left-footed boots while the people had no bread because there was no feedback loop of profit and loss. This suppression of the entrepreneurial spirit didn't just kill the economy. It killed the human drive to create, turning the Soviet worker into a cynical ghost who pretended to work while the state pretended to pay him. A difference that made the American office a powerhouse of energy and the Soviet factory a monument to bored state-sponsored decay. The contrast in the value of talent and the specialized mind revealed the difference between a brain gain and a brain drain. In the US, the war for talent meant that if you were the best at what you did, whether you were a surgeon, a programmer, or a plumber, the system would compete for your services, driving your wages and your quality of life into the stratosphere. The American system understood that human capital is the only capital that matters. In the USSR, the leveling, Uravnilovka ideology meant that a world-class nuclear physicist often made less money than a common truck driver because the party feared that intellectual superiority would lead to political independence. This systematic devaluing of the expert led to an internal emigration, where the brightest minds in the Soviet Union simply stopped trying, hiding their brilliance behind bottles of vodka or menial jobs to avoid the crushing weight of the state's envy. The US became a magnet for the world's genius, while the USSR became a desert where talent was a liability and conformity was the only currency that could buy you a quiet life, proving that a nation that treats its thinkers like cattle will eventually find itself with nothing but a herd. The final layer of this first part is the freedom of movement versus the Propiska system, the ultimate chains of the Soviet worker. In the US, if you didn't like your job or your city, you put your belongings in a car and drove 3,000 miles to find a better life, no questions asked. The freedom to move was the ultimate bargaining chip for the American laborer. In the USSR, you were legally tied to your Propiska, a residence permit that forbade you from moving to a new city without state permission. A worker in the provinces was effectively a serf, unable to move to Moscow or Leningrad for a better job, because the state used geography as a tool of social control. This geographic incarceration ensured that the Soviet worker was always at the mercy of the local factory director and the local party boss, with no escape and no alternative. The American worker was a free agent in a continental market. The Soviet worker was a state tenant in a local cell, a difference in fundamental liberty that ensured the American spirit remained dynamic and restless, while the Soviet soul was slowly crushed under the weight of an eternal, unmoving now. The myth of guaranteed employment in the Soviet Union was perhaps the most effective lie ever told to the global working class, because while it promised a life without the fear of the pink slip, it delivered a life without the hope of the bonus. In the United States, the 1980s workplace was governed by the contract of excellence, where the threat of being fired was the necessary shadow that gave meaning to the light of a promotion. The American system understood that without the risk of failure, there is no psychological fuel for success. In the USSR, the constitutional right to work was actually a duty to work, a legal shackle that meant you could not legally quit your life as a cog. Because the state made it almost impossible to fire anyone for incompetence, Soviet offices and factories became warehouses for the living dead. Millions of people who did nothing but show up, drink tea, and shuffle papers, knowing their paycheck would arrive regardless of their effort. This pseudo-employment created a culture of systemic laziness and the death of the work ethic, where the American worker was obsessed with getting ahead, while the Soviet worker was obsessed with getting by, a difference that turned the US into an economic locomotive and the USSR into a stagnant swamp of wasted hours. The contrast in The Psychology of Wages revealed how the American dollar was a tool of empowerment, while the Soviet ruble was a coupon for a fantasy. In the US, the 1980s saw the rise of performance-based pay, commissions, and stock options, ensuring that if a worker doubled their productivity, they could double their lifestyle. The American wage was a variable of ambition. In the USSR, wages were flatlined. Whether you were the most efficient welder in the Urals or the laziest drunk on the shift, you were paid almost exactly the same tariff. This equality of poverty removed every rational reason for a human being to exert themselves beyond the absolute minimum required to avoid the gulag. Why innovate? Why work harder? Why take care of the equipment? The result was a society where the phrase, "they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work," became the unofficial national anthem. A difference that meant American products were built with pride for a profit, while Soviet products were built with resentment for a quota, often falling apart before they even reached the store. The role of the labor union, defender versus enforcer, showed who actually stood for the workers' rights. In the US, the 1980s were a time of intense but transparent struggle, where labor unions were independent entities that could, and did, shut down entire industries to demand better safety, higher pay, and human dignity. The American Union was the watchdog of the worker. In the USSR, the official trade unions were nothing more than transmission belts for the Communist Party. Their job wasn't to protect the worker from the state, but to protect the state from the worker. Soviet unions managed the distribution of deficit vacation vouchers and sanatorium spots, using them as bribes to keep the masses quiet, while the state ignored safety standards and environmental laws. There were no strikes in the workers' paradise because a strike was treated as treason, and the union leaders were often KGB informants. This castrated labor movement left the Soviet worker completely defenseless against a state that was the world's most ruthless and unaccountable employer, a difference that gave the American worker a voice and the Soviet worker a gag. The contrast in The Hidden Cost of Free Benefits exposed the massive social debt of the Soviet system. In the US, the 1980s saw the expansion of corporate benefit packages, private health insurance, 401k, retirement plans, and educational assistance that were tied to the individual's choice of employer, creating a competitive market for talent where companies had to woo workers with better perks. The American benefit was a reward for choice. In the USSR, free benefits were a tool of dependency. The state provided your apartment, your health care, and your child's schooling, but it could take them all away in a heartbeat if you showed the slightest political dissent. If you were fired in America, you lost your job. If you were fired in the USSR, you could lose your home, your doctor, and your right to live in a major city. This totalitarian paternalism made the Soviet citizen a hostage of the bureaucracy, forced to trade their liberty for a crumbling concrete flat and a doctor who had no medicine, a difference that made the American worker a free agent and the Soviet worker a state tenant. Finally, the vocational training and the obsolescence gap showed which system was preparing for the digital age. In the US, the 1980s were the era of reskilling, where the decline of traditional manufacturing was met with a massive, private sector-led shift toward computer literacy and service sector expertise, allowing millions to transition from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. The American system was adaptive. In the USSR, the vocational schools, PTU, were dumping grounds for the unsuccessful, churning out specialists for heavy industries that were already dying. The state continued to train hundreds of thousands of steel workers and tractor drivers for a world that needed programmers and designers, because the plan said they were needed. This institutional inertia meant that the Soviet Union was building a 19th century workforce to fight a 21st century economic war, a reality that left the country full of experts in technologies that no longer mattered, proving that a society that cannot change its mind about work will eventually find itself with no work left to do. The destruction of professional pride was the silent poison of the Soviet workplace, a stark contrast to the American 1980s, where expertise was a cultural currency that bought both wealth and social respect. In the United States, a master carpenter, a high-end chef, or a software architect was seen as a professional, someone whose specialized skills were a source of individual identity and immense pride. The American system fostered a craftsman's ego, where doing a job well was a matter of personal honor. In the USSR, the state attempted to replace individual pride with socialist competition, a hollow ritual where workers were forced to compete for cardboard certificate of honor or a photo on a board of shame. Because the state owned the results of your labor, the connection between effort and outcome was severed. Soviet workers realized that whether they produced a masterpiece or a piece of junk, the state would take it all the same. This led to the culture of shoddy work, Nat Brack, where the goal was to meet the numerical quota of the plan by any means necessary, even if it meant producing tractors that didn't start or shoes that fell apart in a week. A difference that made Made in USA a global gold standard and Made in USSR a global punchline. The contrast in The Myth of Voluntary Labor exposed the Soviet state as a master of psychological and physical coercion. In the US, the 1980s saw a thriving culture of genuine volunteerism, where citizens freely gave their time to charities, churches, and community projects because they chose to improve their society. The American volunteer was a free citizen. In the USSR, volunteerism was a state mandate disguised as a celebration, most notably the Subotnik, the voluntary unpaid working Saturday. If a Soviet worker refused to participate in these days of cleaning streets or working extra shifts for free, they faced social ostracism, the loss of promotion opportunities, or visits from the party committee. This compulsory enthusiasm was a form of tax on human time, forcing exhausted people to perform menial labor under the watchful eye of the state. While Americans spent their weekends building private lives and hobbies that fueled the leisure economy, Soviets spent theirs performing theater of labor for a regime that stole their rest, proving that a society that has to force its people to volunteer is a society that has already lost their hearts. The role of the workplace as a prison of information showed how the Soviet system feared the very people it claimed to empower. In the US, the 1980s office was a hub of open communication, where the introduction of the fax machine, the personal computer, and the internal memo allowed for the rapid flow of ideas and the challenging of bad management. The American worker was an informed participant. In the USSR, every factory and office was a fortress of secrecy. Photocopying machines, era, were kept in locked rooms under the control of the First Department, KGB, and every internal report was classified to hide the systemic failures of the state. Workers were kept in the dark about the true cost of production, the quality of their output, or the health risks of their environment. This information starvation meant that Soviet employees could never suggest improvements or fix errors because they weren't allowed to know the truth about their own work, a difference that turned the American corporation into a learning organism and the Soviet enterprise into a blind, stumbling giant. The contrast in Women in the Workforce revealed the lie of Soviet gender equality. In the US, the 1980s were a decade of the glass ceiling being shattered as women flooded into law, medicine, and corporate leadership, fighting for equal pay and professional autonomy based on their individual merits. The American woman was a rising force. In the USSR, the state boasted of equality, but the reality was the double burden. Soviet women were forced to work 40 hours a week in demanding industrial or clerical jobs, only to spend another 40 hours standing in bread lines and performing all the domestic labor without the help of the labor-saving appliances that were standard in American homes. Furthermore, while women occupied many low-level medical and teaching roles, the high-ranking nomenklatura and factory directorships remained an almost exclusive club of aging men. The Soviet woman wasn't liberated. She was simply twice employed, a difference that made the American feminist movement a quest for power and the Soviet reality a life of permanent exhaustion and state-mandated equality of struggle. Finally, the reward of leisure showed which system understood the human need for renewal. In the US, the 1980s turned the vacation into a massive industry of choice, from Disney World to European tours, where the worker used their hard-earned capital to buy experiences that were entirely their own. The American at rest was a sovereign individual. In the USSR, leisure was a state distribution. To go to a resort in Crimea or a sanatorium in the Caucasus, you had to beg for a putyovka voucher from your trade union. These trips were often used as a tool of social engineering, where workers were sent to communal dormitories to follow a state-prescribed schedule of healthful activities. You didn't go where you wanted, you went where the state had a vacancy. This regimented rest meant that even in your private time, you were never truly free from the gaze of the collective, a difference that made American leisure a source of creative energy and Soviet leisure a continuation of the state's control over the human body. The erosion of basic morality in the workplace was the final, fatal symptom of the Soviet economic disease, creating a culture of systemic theft that would have been unthinkable in the transparent corporate environment of the United States. In the U.S., the 1980s saw the refinement of internal auditing, inventory controls, and a legal framework that treated embezzlement as a high-stakes crime against the shareholders and the public. The American system was built on the presumption of integrity backed by the certainty of law. In the USSR, theft from the state was not just common, it was a survival strategy. The phrase, "Tisi mozno, ya mozno," everything is permitted, became the silent rule of the factory floor, where workers spent their shifts appropriating everything from light bulbs and copper wire to gasoline and grain. Because everything belonged to the people decided that everything belonged to them personally. This kleptocratic culture turned every Soviet citizen into a petty criminal by necessity, destroying the very concept of honest labor and replacing it with a cynical game of who can steal the most from the state without getting caught? A difference that made the American economy a machine of value creation and the Soviet economy a sieve of value destruction. The contrast in the promotion of the incompetent showed why the Soviet leadership eventually became a gerontocracy of failures. In the U.S., while corporate politics certainly existed, the 1980s was an era of up or out, where managers who failed to produce results were replaced by those who could. The American system was a dynamic meritocracy that prioritized the bottom line over personal loyalty. In the USSR, the nomenklatura system ensured that loyalty to the party was the only metric that mattered. A factory director didn't need to know how to build a better engine. He only needed to know how to flatter the local party secretary. This led to the negative selection of leaders, where the most brilliant and capable individuals were pushed aside in favor of the most compliant and mediocre yes men. By the time the 1980s reached their peak, the Soviet Union was being run by a class of aging bureaucrats who were functionally illiterate in modern economics, leading a nation of frustrated experts who were forced to take orders from men who couldn't operate a calculator. A difference that ensured American companies were led by visionaries while Soviet ministries were led by relics. The role of the shadow economy and the Blatt system turned the Soviet workplace into a marketplace of favors rather than a center of production. In the US, if you wanted a promotion or a better deal, you negotiated a higher salary or found a better paying job in the open market. The American worker used currency as power. In the USSR, money was often secondary to Blatt, the informal network of "I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine." A worker at a meatpacking plant would steal prime cuts of beef to trade with a worker at a tire factory, who would in turn trade with a doctor for imported medicine. This barter of desperation meant that the most important skill in the Soviet workplace wasn't your professional ability, but your social connections. Your value to society wasn't what you could make, but what you could get through the back door. This corruption of the social contract turned the entire nation into a web of conspiracy, where the working class was too busy bartering stolen goods to bother with the actual work of building the socialist paradise. The contrast in the workplace as a cultural hub revealed which society was truly progressive. In the US, the 1980s office was a place of rapid social change, where diversity, professional networking, and the exchange of global ideas created a vibrant, cosmopolitan atmosphere that fueled the creative class. The American workplace was a laboratory of the future. In the USSR, the workplace was a stagnation zone. Beyond the mandatory party meetings and the drab red corners filled with dusty Lenin busts, there was no intellectual life. Workers were encouraged to be passive recipients of state culture, attending sanctioned lectures and watching state-approved films. Any attempt to start an independent book club, a jazz band, or a discussion group was viewed as a potential counter-revolutionary cell. This cultural sterility ensured that the Soviet worker remained intellectually isolated, a prisoner of a 1920s worldview in a 1980s world, proving that a state that fears the minds of its workers will eventually lose the hands of its workers as well. Finally, the secret aristocracy of the Soviet Union provided the ultimate proof that the classless society was a total fraud. In the US, the wealth of a billionaire was visible, taxable, and often used to fund philanthropy or further investment. The American elite was a visible class. In the USSR, the elite lived in a shadow world of state-owned dachas, special black Volga cars with tinted windows, and exclusive yellow label shops where they could buy Marlboro cigarettes and Scotch whiskey while the public starved. This hidden inequality was far more corrosive than American capitalism because it was based on theft through status rather than wealth through creation. The Soviet workers saw the nomenklatura children going to elite schools and traveling to the West while they were stuck in a concrete box, realizing that the revolution had merely replaced one set of masters with another, far more hypocritical one. This class resentment was the ticking time bomb in the heart of the Soviet workplace, a realization that the workers' state was actually the bureaucrats' kingdom, and that the only way to win was to stop playing the game entirely. The final verdict of the Cold War on the battlefield of labor was delivered not by tanks or missiles, but by the sheer, undeniable exhaustion of the Soviet spirit. In the United States, the 1980s ended with a workforce that, despite economic fluctuations, remained the most productive, innovative, and optimistic on Earth. The American system proved that when you give a person the right to own their labor, the right to fail, and the right to keep the rewards of their talent, you unlock a source of energy more powerful than any nuclear reactor. The American dream survived because it was built on the dignity of the self. In the USSR, the decade ended with a total moral and physical breakdown. The workers' paradise had become a land of internal emigrants, people who had physically stayed in their country but had mentally checked out of the system years ago. The Soviet dream died because it was built on the slavery of the collective, a realization that when everyone is equally responsible for everything, no one is responsible for anything, and the entire structure eventually collapses into a pile of rust and resentment. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the ultimate exit interview for a failed employer. Millions of workers who had been told for 70 years that they were the masters of the state didn't lift a finger to save the regime when it started to crumble. In fact, they were the ones who pushed it over the edge. The American middle class, born from a century of competition and choice, became the foundation of a global era of prosperity, while the former Soviet worker was left standing in the ruins of a factory that shouldn't have been built, clutching rubles that were worth less than the paper they were printed on. This was the final proof that a command economy can build a pyramid or a prison, but it can never build a home for the human spirit. The American self-made man walked into the 21st century as a creator of the future, while the Soviet state cog was left behind in a museum of failed ideologies, a warning to history that any system that denies the individual the right to dream will eventually find itself with nothing but a nightmare. The lesson for us today is that the right to work is meaningless without the freedom to choose. A society that treats its workers as assets to be managed will always lose to a society that treats its citizens as individuals to be empowered. The American workplace remains a beacon of hope because it is a place where your story is written by your own hands, not by the stamp of a bureaucrat. The Soviet workplace remains a ghost of history because it tried to turn the human heart into a mechanical part, forgetting that a person who is forced to work is just a slave with a different name. The ultimate victory of the American dream was not the defeat of the Soviet Union, but the global realization that liberty is the only true engine of progress, and that a nation is only as strong as the dreams of its humblest worker. What do you think was the fatal flaw that finally broke the Soviet worker? Was it the lack of actual goods to buy with their wages, the soul-crushing boredom of a job they didn't choose, or the disgusting hypocrisy of the elite who lived in luxury while preaching socialist equality? Could you survive a week in a system where ambition was a crime and conformity was the only way to survive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective helps us unmask the lies of history and celebrate the freedom we often take for granted. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share this video with anyone who still thinks the Soviet paradise was actually a paradise for the worker. See you in the next deep dive into the secrets of the Cold War.